Have you ever spent the night alone in the cemetery? A fear that can knock you down. On one of the nights in July, clouds obscured the moon, and the distant howling of wolves could be heard. The cemetery was shrouded in fog, and Mr. James, the graveyard keeper, was walking slowly in front of a tomb while holding a lantern in one hand and his dog's leash in the other. It was evident from his expression that he was very angry. He glanced at the grave in front of him and muttered, "I can't believe this beast is dead." He pulled a crumpled newspaper from his dusty coat pocket and began to read it quietly as he walked toward the office. Ludovico, the psychopathic killer, has finally been killed. He had been arrested by the police 3 times, and each time he escaped from prison until he was finally shot dead by the officers. The body was brought to this remote cemetery for burial. That ruthless killer had murdered 13 people and had a long history of wickedness, theft, brutality, and assault. He was a wild human being and a devil worshipper. Those who had been with him and lived alongside him said that at night he would go into the darkness, talk with demons and spirits. They claimed he always carried a bottle full of blood and would drink it whenever he was thirsty. Mr. James crumpled the newspaper again and angrily threw it toward Ludovico's grave. As he cursed at it, he moved closer and began to kick the tomb. He was startled back to reality by his dog barking incessantly. At that moment, he heard something stirring beneath the ground of Ludovico's grave. Mr. James bent down to listen more closely to the sound coming from the grave. Suddenly, a scream echoed from within the grave, sending shivers through Mr. James. As he held his ear, he took a few steps back and saw the grave crack open in the middle. A multitude of small and large snakes slithered out from the grave. As soon as James spotted the snakes, he turned to flee, but he stumbled and fell to the ground. A black rope had wrapped around his legs, pulling him back toward the grave. Just when he reached his original spot beside the grave, a snake resembling a giant dragon emerged from within. James was paralyzed with fear. He struggled desperately to free himself from the rope, but it was futile. Ludovico, with a devilish grin on his face, said, "Mr. James, you were looking for me?" At that moment, he wrapped his long fingers around Mr. James's neck and lifted him into the air. The corpse's face resembled white chalk, and its eyes were like those of a snake. With sharp, long nails, it dragged across Mr. James's neck. He tore open the jugular vein in Mr. James's neck, and blood gushed out like a fountain. At that moment, Ludovico began to drink the blood. Poor Mr. James, who was on the verge of death, screamed, "You're a murderer, a psychopathic killer." With every word Mr. James uttered, Ludovico's laughter grew louder and more sinister. Eventually, after suffocating Mr. James, he threw his body into its own grave and then went into Mr. James's office. The dog, terrified, was running around and howling. Ludovico, dressed in a coat and hat, emerged from the office and left the cemetery, stepping out into the street. Just then, a drunken homeless man, oblivious to the world and singing to himself, spotted Ludovico and shouted, "Hey, you! Who gave you permission to walk in my territory?" Ludovico, pulling down the brim of his hat, replied in a hollow voice, "Ludovico the killer." The homeless man, now sober with fear, began to run and lost himself in the dark alleys. Just when he thought he had escaped Ludovico, the killer appeared right in front of him. As he always did when killing, Ludovico plunged his broken and jagged nails, sharp as swords, into the poor man's throat and started drinking his blood. "If you're scared, then give us a lie, so we know how many others like you have the courage to hear the rest of the story." After killing him, he carelessly discarded the body in a corner and returned to his hideout, which was filled with blood, cobwebs, and filth. The walls bore signs of devilish symbols. Exhausted, Ludovico crawled into his bed, which was covered in dirt and resembled a black coffin, and fell asleep. That same morning, Daniel, one of Ludovico's former friends, who had played a significant role in his capture, was enjoying breakfast peacefully. Daniel had previously assisted in 2 of Ludovico's murders, but felt regret after learning that Ludovico had killed his own brother over a debt. He decided to repent in church and became a sworn enemy of Ludovico. After some time, Daniel betrayed Ludovico and spent some time in prison for his complicity. When he heard about Ludovico's death, he thought to himself, "Thank God, the murders and assaults by Ludovico are over." He turned on the television just as the news reported the murder of a homeless man on the street, killed in the same style as Ludovico's victims. Upon hearing this, Daniel choked on his food and started coughing. He got up and turned off the TV, feeling as if someone was behind him. As he turned his head around, he received a strong blow to the head and lost consciousness. When he opened his eyes again, he found himself in a damp, dark room resembling a crypt. He looked around in astonishment at the cobweb-covered walls and old furniture. Then he noticed a demonic circle around on the floor. The only source of light in the room came from 2 candles hanging on the wall, casting a faint yellow glow that illuminated the space just a bit. A soft sound of footsteps echoed in the room as Ludovico entered, wearing a long black cloak. His face looked more terrifying than ever. In one hand, he held a dirty, old knife, and in the other, a tattered booklet on devil worship. With a strange demeanor, he knelt in front of Daniel, who was bound and unable to move, and in his lifeless voice said, "Well, my friend, we finally meet again." Daniel replied bitterly, "You are the devil himself. You decided us. I'm glad I paved the way for you. You filthy creature. How did you survive? Ludovico said with a devilish grin. Let me tell you. He continued as he stood up and began to speak. After escaping from the authorities, one of them shot me and I died. But just as I was leaving this world, the devil came to me. He made me his chief soldier and gave me power. I was brought back to life. The devil arranged everything for me. The forensic doctor was one of our own devil worshippers who helped me and devised a plan to make everyone think I was dead. Everyone believed I had died and buried me. After they all left, I regained consciousness hours later and emerged from the ground. The plan was going smoothly until the cemetery guard saw me trying to rise from the grave, and I had to kill him and bury him in his own grave. But then I encountered a homeless man which left a small trace of me. I didn't care at all. Now I have came to take my revenge. At that moment, Ludovico shouted again, a sacrifice for the devil. He then recited an incantation and 3 of his loyal followers appeared. Daniel looked anxiously at the faces of his 2 former accomplices, Julie and Gert, who were Ludovico's best men. The 3rd person was a newcomer, whose face showed hatred and anger, bowing as Ludovico called him, my savior. Ludovico addressed all his companions. We are gathered here today to take revenge. This traitor Daniel is the one who sold us out and caused many of us to be captured and imprisoned. I suffered to the point of death. Now it's time for revenge. He pulled Daniel into the center of the circle and stood over him while the other 3 formed a ring around them. Ludovico used the knife to cut into Daniel's arm, letting his blood flow into a cup before taking a sip himself. He then offered it to Gert to drink as well. Gert passed the cup to the doctor and finally it reached Julie. She drank from the cup and then took the knife from Ludovico's hand, saying, "I'll sacrifice him." At that moment, Julie pointed the knife at Ludovico and quickly untied Daniel's hands. "Run!" she shouted. Daniel sprang to his feet, kicked Gert beside him, and headed for the door while Julie threw a punch at the doctor. Ludovico looked around in disbelief as Julie exclaimed, "Ludovico, you killed my father, the graveyard keeper." Just as Julie and Daniel were about to exit through the door, Ludovico made a swift move, grabbed the knife, and threw it at them. Since Julie was behind, the knife struck her, and she collapsed to the ground. Daniel, being ahead, managed to escape, hearing only a pained groan from Julie, who had been injured. The area around the house was dense with tall trees, and Daniel ran with his last bit of strength while Ludovico and his men chased after him. What will happen to Daniel? Will he be able to escape from this bloodthirsty man? Or will he be Ludovico's next victim? Stay with us until the end of the video. Daniel knew that the only safe place he could go was the church. But how would he find a church in the middle of this forest? As he pondered this, a horse suddenly emerged from the darkness. Daniel considered it a sign from God and quickly mounted the horse, galloping out of the forest. He could hear Ludovico's voice fading weaker and weaker until he finally distanced himself from Ludovico and his men. After some time, he exited the forest and found a small village with just 3 or 4 houses and a small church. Daniel jumped off the horse and rushed into the church. The atmosphere inside made him feel safe and calm. He searched for the church's owner, and an old man with a long white beard approached him from the back of the church. "Yes, my son, did you need something?" he asked. "Yes," Daniel replied, "I need your help." The church owner noticed Daniel's pale face and asked, "What happened? Why do you look so frightened?" "Ludovico, the killer, has returned and is trying to kill me. The devil has brought him back and given him dark powers." Daniel then recounted the entire story to the church owner, explaining that he wanted to know if there was a way to destroy Ludovico. The church owner replied, "There is only one way. We must act against the triangle of the devil." Daniel excitedly asked, "Okay, tell me what to do." The church owner explained that they needed to create a potion to counteract the devil's influence and destroy Ludovico once and for all. To create this potion, they would need a mixture made from Ludovico's father's bones, the blood of one of his loyal followers, and your blood as his enemy. Finally, they would need to recite several verses from the Quran over this potion. Daniel replied with surprise, "The first part is going to be difficult. I can manage the rest. But where are we going to find the bones of Ludovico's father?" The church owner said the elder Mirza was one of the great sheikhs. He never thought his son would become a child of the devil. However, his wife had contrary beliefs and practiced devil worship while she was pregnant with Ludovico, reading satanic books away from her husband's eyes. One day, Mirza returned home earlier than usual and discovered his wife's satanic books. He learned everything and kicked her out of the house while intending to kill her and their child. In short, she escaped from him and gave birth alone in the ruins of the forest. Over the years, she became one with her thoughts and mind with the devil. Ludovico, now grown up, knew that his father was Madison and that he was a servant of the devil. He killed Madison, his biological father, but for some unknown reason, he later killed his own mother as well. Daniel, astonished, asked where Madison's grave was. The church owner replied that this was in front of the church in the village of Harun, behind the forest, where there was a cemetery that had been submerged after a flood a few years ago. In despair, Daniel said, "So I have to go underwater?" The church owner sadly confirmed, "Unfortunately, yes." Daniel left the church, but he made up his mind. He mounted his horse and galloped off toward the forest. Inside the woods, he could hear the hooting of owls and the howling of foxes. The sound of branches snapping added a frightening atmosphere to the darkness of the forest. After about an hour of riding, he reached the back of the forest, where a relatively large lake lay before him, illuminated by the moonlight. Daniel reached into the saddlebag on his horse and wrapped the rope around the stake. The water was cold, but Daniel had no choice. He secured himself tightly and dove into the water. As he opened his eyes underwater, it was very dark, and a chilling sensation filled him. With his last strength, he swam deeper and turned on his small flashlight, looking for gravestones to find Madison's grave. God was with him, and soon he spotted Mirza's grave, with a bone from his hand sticking out from under the soil. Daniel grabbed the bone and swam back toward the surface with all his might. As he emerged from the water, he noticed someone running toward him from the darkness of the forest. The horse, sensing danger, bolted into the woods. Daniel put the bone in his pocket and quickly detached a nail from a tree trunk, hiding behind it. The figure emerging from the darkness was Gert, holding a knife in his hand. Gert passed right in front of Daniel, who struck him on the head with all his strength, killing him instantly. However, the doctor approached Daniel from another direction and struck him from behind with a spear, wounding him. As Daniel lost blood, he threw the nail at the doctor, injuring him as well. Daniel crawled to the saddlebag that had fallen to the ground when the horse fled and pulled out a glass vial. He went over to Gert's body and collected some of Gert's blood in the vial. Then he dropped the bone inside it and added some of his own blood as well. Following this, he recited the verses that the church owner had told him to say. The mixture in the vial began to tremble and steam as it bubbled. At that moment, a hollow voice screamed from deep within the forest. Ludovico emerged from the woods, his face twisted in rage. Daniel lay on the ground, writhing in pain, knowing that death was near. Ludovico rushed toward him. The glass and its contents transformed into an old book that pulsed like a heartbeat. Daniel gripped it tightly in his hand and opened it. Inside there was something resembling a black hole. He knew that this heart contained Ludovico's demonic spirit. Without hesitation, he plunged a knife into its center, and black blood gushed out like a fountain, the scream of Ludovico shaking the entire forest. When Daniel looked at Ludovico, he saw that his face had returned to normal. It was no longer terrifying or demonic. Moments later, Ludovico lost consciousness, and Daniel immediately felt darkness closing in on him before he too fainted. When he regained consciousness, he found himself in a hospital with the church owner by his side. Daniel couldn't speak, and the church owner said, "Calm down, my son. After you left, your horse returned, and I realized something had happened to you. I called the police and rode to the address I had given you. When I arrived, 2 men were dead, and you were there with the unconscious Ludovico." Do you think this story is true? If you think this story is possible and true, tell us in the comments, and also tell us which stories you like the most. I tied up Ludovico and handed him over to the police. They brought you to the hospital, and I'm sure the police will forgive you. They know you were defending yourself. The next day, a trial was held, and Ludovico was ultimately sentenced to death. Daniel is still in his hospital gown, attended to execution. When Ludovico was hanged and died forever, a chilling and sinister smile remained on his lips. The noose tied around his neck. His face had turned pale, and his gaze was fixed on Daniel.